Thanks for joining us here at 10. I'm Doug Warner. Breaking tonight, life in prison. That's the sentence handed down to Trevion Anderson for his involvement in the killing of Shreveport police officer Chateri Payne. Last month, Anderson was found guilty for planning and carrying out Officer Payne's murder
On January 9, 2019, Officer Chateri Payne stepped out of her front door in full uniform, ready for what should have been just another shift. It was the last time she was ever seen alive. When police arrived, her boyfriend had a story. Calm, convincing, almost too perfect. But the truth wasn't in what he said. It was already hiding inside his phone the whole time. If you follow true crime stories like this, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Stories Chronicles. And before we continue, where are you watching from right now? Let me know in the comments. Chateri Payne was only 22 years old when her life was taken. At an age where most people are still figuring things out, she had already stepped into a role that demanded courage, discipline, and responsibility. She had recently graduated from the police academy in Shreveport, Louisiana, an achievement that didn't come easy. It required long hours, physical endurance, and mental strength. And she pushed through it all, determined to build a future for herself and for her child. Just 3 months into her career as a police officer, Chateri was still new to the job. She was learning the rhythms of patrol, adjusting to the weight of the uniform, and stepping into a profession where every shift could bring the unexpected. But from everything known about her, she took that responsibility seriously. This wasn't just a paycheck. It was something she chose, a path she committed to. But beyond the badge, beyond the uniform, there was another side of her life that mattered even more. Chateri was a mother. She had a young daughter, someone who depended on her, someone she was raising and protecting. That role shaped her decisions, her priorities, and the way she approached life. Everything she was building, her career, her independence, was not just for herself, but for her child. To her family, she wasn't Officer Payne. She was Lice, a daughter who was loved deeply, someone they spoke to regularly. Someone who had plans, goals, and a future that was still unfolding. There was a sense that she was just getting started, like her life was opening up into something bigger. And like many young women her age, she was also navigating relationships, responsibilities, and the challenges that come with trying to balance everything at once. She wasn't perfect, she was real. A young woman trying to make the right decisions, trying to build stability, trying to grow. That's what makes what happened next so difficult to process. Because the danger that ended her life didn't come from a call she responded to. It didn't come from the streets she patrolled. It came from much closer. And to understand how things reached that point, you have to look at the relationship she was in, and how quickly things began to change. At the center of Chateri Payne's personal life was a relationship that, at one point, likely felt like stability. Trevion Anderson wasn't just someone who's dating, he was the father of her child. They lived together in Shreveport, raising their daughter under the same roof. For Chateri, life was evolving quickly. She had just stepped into a demanding career. Long hours, new responsibilities, and the pressure that comes with being a police officer. At the same time, she was raising a child, trying to maintain stability, trying to grow into both roles at once. And in the middle of all that, the relationship began to strain. There were moments where control seemed to surface. Not always obvious, not always extreme, but enough to create discomfort, enough to shift the dynamic, enough to make things feel off. At times, emotions ran high, the kind of tension that doesn't just stay in arguments, but lingers afterward. Words exchanged that don't fully go away, reactions that feel disproportionate, a sense that something underneath the surface isn't right. And when a relationship reaches that point, it changes how decisions are made. For someone like Chateri, young, responsible, focused on her child and her future, those changes matter. Because they force a question. Is this the environment I want to stay in? It's not always a dramatic realization. Sometimes it's gradual, a growing awareness, a quiet understanding that something needs to change. The connection between them was no longer steady. It had become unpredictable. There were emotional highs and lows, moments of calm followed by tension. A cycle that can leave someone feeling uncertain about what comes next. For Chateri, the thought of leaving began to take shape. not out of impulse, but out of clarity. Trevion Anderson wasn't just part of her past or her present. He was someone deeply connected to her life, and that made everything more complicated. Because leaving doesn't just affect one person, it affects everyone involved, and not everyone responds to it the same way. For some it's acceptance, for others, it's something else entirely. Something harder to predict, something harder to control. And in this case, as that distance between them grew, so did something else. Something that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. Not in words, not in actions anyone could clearly point to. According to court findings, she had begun making plans to move out of the home she shared with Trevion Anderson. It wasn't a rushed choice. It came after everything she had been carrying. The pressure of her new career, the responsibility of motherhood, and the growing strain inside that relationship. For a 22-year-old, that kind of decision takes courage. Because leaving isn't simple. It means change. It means uncertainty. It means stepping into the unknown with a child depending on you to get it right. But it also means choosing something different. Choosing peace over tension. Choosing stability over unpredictability. Choosing a future that feels safer. Chateri was moving in that direction. She was preparing to create distance, to start fresh, to build a life that no longer depended on a relationship that had begun to break down. And for her, it likely felt like taking control back. But for Trevion Anderson, it meant something else entirely. From his perspective, this wasn't just a breakup. It was a loss of control, a disruption of what he believed was his place in her life. And for some people, that shift doesn't register as a normal part of relationships ending. It feels like rejection, like abandonment, like something being taken from them. As Chateri Payne was preparing to leave, there were already signs that something was shifting behind the scenes. Signs that, at the time, may not have seemed as serious as they truly were. But once investigators began examining what had been happening in the days leading up to her death, a different picture started to form. It started with messages. Trevion Anderson had sent texts that went beyond frustration or arguments. In one exchange, he expressed a desire to kill Chateri and another individual. These weren't vague statements made in passing. They were direct, aggressive, and deeply concerning. The kind of messages that cross a line from emotion into intent. And yet, in many situations like this, those words can be dismissed. Seen as anger, seen as something said in the heat of the moment. But in this case, they were something more, because the messages didn't exist on their own. There was also his search history. At some point before the shooting, Anderson searched questions online that stood out immediately to investigators. One of them was, "Can you die from a gunshot to the leg?" Another search focused on what happens to the body after being shot, and how a person might survive it. These weren't random searches. They pointed to a specific kind of thinking, trying to understand how gunshots affect the body, what injuries are fatal, and what outcomes are possible. It suggested that he wasn't just angry, he was thinking through violence, trying to understand it, trying to control it. And then there were the conversations with others. Investigators uncovered communication between Anderson and two men, Lawrence Pierre II and Glenn Frierson. These weren't casual interactions. The messages showed coordination, timing, awareness of Chateri's movements. There were discussions about when she would be home, when she would be leaving. Details that would only matter if someone was planning to act on them. That's what made this situation different. It wasn't just one person reacting emotionally, it was multiple people communicating with a shared purpose. And the more those conversations were examined, the clearer that purpose became. There was a build-up happening. Piece by piece, message by message, search by search. What might have seemed disconnected at first began to align into something much more serious. Because when you combine threats, targeted searches about gunshot wounds, and communication with others who would later be involved, it creates a pattern that's hard to ignore. A pattern that points toward intent. A pattern that shows movement from thought to action. And all of this was happening while Chateri was focused on something entirely different. She wasn't looking over her shoulder, expecting what was coming next. She wasn't aware that conversations were happening about her. That people were discussing her movements, that someone close to her was sharing information that could be used against her. From her perspective, life was going smoothly. January 9th, 2019 moved forward like any other evening. Inside the home in Shreveport, Louisiana, there was nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. It was routine, familiar. The kind of night that blends into countless others when you're balancing work and family. Chateri Payne was preparing for her shift. Her uniform was on. Everything in place. She was stepping into her role as a police officer, one she had only recently begun, still new, still adjusting, still building confidence with every shift. This was part of her routine now. Get ready, head out, do the job. Inside the house, her child was there. Close, safe, unaware. There's something about moments like that, ordinary, quiet, predictable, that makes what happens next feel even more jarring. Because nothing about that evening signaled danger. Nothing warned her that stepping outside would be the last thing she would ever do. She moved through the house, likely focused on the small details people think about before leaving. What time it was, what needed to be done later, how the night ahead would unfold. Then she headed for the door. She stepped outside into the night air, walking toward her car. The distance wasn't far. Just a few steps across the driveway. A path she had walked before, without hesitation, without fear. But this time was different, because she wasn't alone. Somewhere nearby, waiting, were the men who had already made a decision about what was going to happen next. There was no warning. The first gunshot broke the silence, then another, then more. The sound was sudden, sharp, overwhelming, echoing through the space around her. In an instant, everything changed. Chateri was struck. One bullet hit her foot, another tore into her side. And then, a final shot. To the head. Her body gave way almost immediately, collapsing onto the driveway, the same place she had just been walking across seconds earlier, unaware of what was about to unfold. There was no time to run, no time to process, no time to call for help. Just impact, pain, and then stillness. Inside the house, her child was there. Close enough that the sound of gunfire would have been impossible to ignore. A moment that no child should ever experience, hearing violence erupt just outside the place that's supposed to be safe. Outside, the shooters were gone as quickly as they had appeared. The entire attack lasted only moments, but the damage was irreversible. Emergency response followed. She was rushed to a local trauma center, but the injuries were too severe. Despite every effort, the outcome didn't change. At just 22 years old, Chateri Payne was gone. A police officer who had barely begun her career. A mother whose child would now grow up without her. And the location of the attack, the driveway of her own home, added another layer to the tragedy. Because this wasn't something that happened in the line of duty. It didn't happen during a call. It didn't happen while responding to danger. It happened in a place that should have been safe. A place tied to routine, to family, to everyday life. And as the scene settled, one question began to take shape. One that would drive everything that came next. Who knew she would be there, at that exact moment? Because this wasn't random. The timing was too precise, the location too specific, the execution too direct. And the answer to that, Phuanam. At this point, think about everything you've heard so far. I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And if you've been following this case closely, stay with me. Because what comes next changes everything. In the hours after the shooting, one thing became clear almost immediately. This was not a random act of violence. Chateri Payne had been targeted. The location, the timing, the way the attack was carried out, it all pointed in one direction. Whoever did this knew exactly when she would step outside. They knew where she would be. They didn't hesitate. That level of certainty doesn't come from guessing. It comes from inside information. And as investigators began to look closer at the people around her, attention quickly shifted to someone who was already part of her everyday life. Trevion Anderson. The man she lived with. The father of her child. At first, his presence might not have raised immediate suspicion. After all, he was someone close to her. Someone who would naturally be near the situation. But as details started to surface, that assumption began to fall apart. Because the evidence didn't point away from him. It pointed directly at him. Phone records, messages, and communication began to reveal a connection that couldn't be ignored. Investigators discovered that Anderson had been in contact with two other men. These weren't random acquaintances. These were individuals who would soon be linked directly to the attack. The people responsible weren't just acting on opportunity. They were acting on information. Trevion Anderson wasn't just connected to the situation because he lived there. He was connected because he had played a role in what happened. He had communicated with the men who carried out the shooting. He had shared details about when Chateri would be outside. He had helped create the conditions that made the attack possible. The involvement of Lawrence Pierre II and Glenn Frierson added another layer. This wasn't a one-person decision carried out in isolation. It involved coordination between multiple individuals, each playing a role in the same outcome. The shooters carried out the act. From the moment officers arrived at the scene, it was clear this case would move quickly. This wasn't just another homicide, it was the killing of a police officer. That alone meant immediate attention, resources, and urgency. But beyond that, the nature of the attack raised serious questions. The precision of it, the timing, the location, it didn't feel random. And that changed how investigators approached everything from the very beginning. Within days of the killing, arrests were made. Lawrence Pierre II and Glenn Frierson were taken into custody, along with Trevion Anderson. The speed of those arrests reflected how quickly the pieces had come together. This wasn't a case that dragged on for weeks or months before suspects were identified. The evidence led investigators straight to them. As the case developed, more details surfaced. Messages between the men, search history tied to Anderson, statements and records that aligned with the timeline of the crime. Each piece reinforced the same conclusion. By the time charges were filed, the direction of the case was firmly established. Trevion Anderson was charged in connection with the murder of Chateri Payne, alongside the two men who carried out the shooting. And while the arrests brought answers, they also confirmed something that was difficult to accept. The crime had not come from outside her world. It had come from within it, from someone who knew her life closely enough to predict her next move, and use that knowledge against her. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the focus shifted from what happened to proving how it happened. Prosecutors laid out a clear sequence of events. Not just the shooting itself, but everything that led up to it. The messages, the communication between Trevion Anderson and the two men involved, and the digital evidence that showed intent before a single shot was fired. This wasn't presented as a moment of anger. It was presented as a decision, a series of choices that moved from thought to discussion to action. The jury heard about the threats, the online searches, the coordination with Lawrence Pierre II and Glenn Frierson. Each detail added weight to the argument that this had been planned ahead of time, not something that happened without warning. For the defense, there was little room to challenge the structure of that evidence. The connections were direct, the timeline was tight, and the role Anderson played could not be separated from the outcome. When the verdict came, it reflected that reality. Trevion Anderson was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy. The sentence followed, life in prison without the possibility of parole. A final decision that ensured he would never return to the life he once had. But while the legal process reached its conclusion, the emotional side of the case remained far from settled. Because in that courtroom, the loss wasn't measured in years or charges. It was measured in absence. During sentencing, Chateri Payne's family had the opportunity to speak, and when they did, they didn't speak about a case. They spoke about her, a daughter they could no longer call. A presence that had been part of their everyday lives, now gone. They spoke about the silence that followed her death, the kind that doesn't go away. And while the sentence brought accountability, it didn't bring closure, because nothing about that moment could restore what had been taken. After the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, what remained was the reality of what Chateri Payne's absence meant. For her family, the loss was constant. It showed up in the quiet moments, the ones where her voice should have been there, the routines that once included her, the spaces she used to fill without effort. But the deepest impact fell on someone who didn't fully understand what had happened. Her child, a young girl who lost her mother in an instant, and at the same time, lost her father in a different way. Because while one life was taken, the other was removed through imprisonment. that left a child growing up without either parent. No memories being created, no guidance from the two people who brought her into the world, just the absence of both. That's a kind of loss that doesn't resolve over time. It changes shape, but it stays. For Chateri's family, stepping in meant trying to rebuild something around that absence, providing care, support, and stability where there had once been a complete household. But even with that, the reality doesn't disappear. Every milestone becomes a reminder. Every birthday, every achievement, every moment where a parent should be present. And beyond the family, there's the broader impact, the loss of a young officer who had only just begun her career. Someone who had chosen a path of service, who was still learning, still growing, still figuring out what that role would become for her. All of it ended in a single night. What remains is the memory of who she was, and the reality of what was taken, not just from her, but from everyone connected to her life. Because when something like this happens, it doesn't stop at one person. It reaches outward. And it stays. When you step back from the details of this case, certain patterns begin to stand out. Patterns that show up in many situations like this, even if the outcomes don't always reach this level of violence. One of the most important realities is this: leaving can be the most dangerous moment. It's often seen as the solution, the turning point where someone chooses a different path. But for the person being left behind, that moment can feel like a loss of control. And when control is already an issue, that shift can trigger a serious escalation. In Chateri Payne's case, the decision to leave wasn't impulsive. It came after tension had already built over time, but once that decision became real, everything changed. And that's where warning signs matter. Not always obvious at first, not always extreme, but present. Threats, whether spoken directly or sent through messages, should never be dismissed as just words. In this case, those messages existed before the violence happened. They reflected intent long before action followed. There were also changes in behavior, increased tension, emotional reactions that didn't match the situation, a sense that something wasn't stable anymore. When those signs appear together, they don't exist in isolation. They build on each other, and when they're ignored or minimized, the risk grows. Another important point is documentation. Keeping records of messages, threats, and interactions can become critical, not just for legal reasons, but for clarity, because it helps establish patterns that might otherwise be overlooked. Reporting is equally important, even though it's often difficult. It can feel complicated, especially when the situation involves someone close. But speaking up creates a record. It creates awareness, and in some cases, it creates an opportunity for intervention. At the same time, this case highlights gaps that still exist. Situations where warning signs are present, but action isn't taken early enough. Where threats are known, but not fully addressed. Where escalation happens faster than systems can respond. These gaps don't always lead to outcomes like this. But when they do, the consequences are permanent. And that's what makes stories like this important to understand, because it shows how quickly life can shift from familiar to final, without warning, without time to react. Chateri Payne wasn't in the middle of a call. She wasn't facing danger on the job, she was at home. And that's what makes this story difficult to process. A place tied to daily life became the place where it ended. When you look back at it now, it's not just about how she died. It's about who she was in those moments before it happened. Focused on her future, focused on her child, moving forward in her life, and unaware that someone close to her had already made a decision that would take all of that away. If this story moved you, take a moment to support the channel by subscribing and sharing this video with someone else. Stories like this matter, not just for awareness, but for understanding the signs that often come before situations like this unfold. And I'd like to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Drop them in the comments below. And I'll see you in the next story.